Well now, I picked up the guitar back in the fabulous 60s when the folk scare was on. I started playing guitar though, actually sort of indirectly. I started with the ukulele. For my 15th birthday, I think my father gave me a ukulele and some sort of chord book that had to do with Kingston Trio songs and things like that played on the ukulele. And so I started bugging for a guitar for Christmas, of course. My birthday being in the summertime, then just started adopting the ukulele chords to the guitar once I got it. And it's interesting because within 3 days of having that guitar, I knew that that's what I wanted to do, was play the guitar. Poor Dad, of course, because that's all I would do. I don't remember how many times then over the course of my high school career, he would come down in the basement where I was playing guitar and tell me I was supposed to be doing my homework, and I would tell him I was doing my homework. But it all worked out. And after about a year then I got an electric guitar and started a rock band with some friends and played in rock bands for a couple of years. I suppose that was actually probably within 6 months of getting a guitar, because by the time I'd been playing a year, I seemed to remember that at some point I was watching a guy on TV, some local folkie who was finger picking, and I kind of thought, well, that doesn't look very hard. And so I took the guitar, and not the electric one, but the little Silvertone acoustic that I still had, and kind of figured out, you know, some simple pattern things, the things that people call Travis picking that really are nothing like Travis picking, the kind of folk patterns that people like the Kingston Trio and Peter, Paul, and Mary played. So then I started trying to do that at the same time I was playing in these teenage rock bands. I'm very lucky that in those days it was harder to record things in a casual way than it is for kids now. So that means there's no record of me doing any of this stuff, because I'm sure I would have been blackmailed for all time if anybody could hear what I sounded like. Eventually the electric bands became interested in trying to imitate like the Paul Butterfield band, and so I was trying to play like Mike Bloomfield and not doing a very good job of it. But the acoustic thing attracted me more, and I was interested in blues and things like that. But then I think what was really crucial in Richmond, Virginia, where all this was happening in the mid-'60s, was that I met a piano player named Buck Evans who played ragtime and knew all about ragtime at a time when nobody knew about ragtime, and it kind of takes a little effort of imagination at this point. When you go back before the kind of revival that ragtime had with Joshua Rifkin and things like the Sting in the 70s. Then in the 60s, ragtime had been completely forgotten, except for, of course, by a few people like Max Morath. And so then I was trying from pretty early on to try to play things like Maple Leaf Rag, for instance, is an arrangement that I made when I was about 17 or 18. Pineapple Rag. The few classic rags that I arranged were from when I was a teenager. But Buck was also a person who sort of managed to instill in me the idea that America had a real culture that was all connected, that it wasn't just ragtime over here and blues over here and the bluegrass somewhere else, that all those things were part of the same music. And that was really lucky for me, because I think a lot of people get confused about that. And I've always felt that what I wanted to do was to learn as much as I could about all those styles of music and to work as hard as I could on being able to play as well as I could in as many different styles, because they were ultimately the same style. So that the approach is very much like a classical musician who might study very modern, crazy stuff, and at the same time be somebody like Julian Bream, for instance, who will have very modern tunes written for him that don't have meter or recognizable melodies, but also is a great performer of Renaissance music on the lute. And so my idea was that I wanted to learn how to do all that with these various kinds of American music. I'm not sure if that sounds the way that I felt. The way that I felt was that because I was coming from like a middle-class background where what I grew up with on the radio as far as my own folk music would have been something like the Beach Boys, I wanted something with sort of more oomph to it, and I felt like that because I didn't come from, say, a hillbilly community where they had bluegrass music just in the house, or a black community where they had all kinds of great music just out, you know, like my friend Jerry Ricks talked about growing up in Philadelphia, where you could hear great musicians literally on the street. You had somebody like Lonnie Johnson playing in one hotel around the corner. You had a great modern jazz musician. I grew up in a community where there wasn't any of that, and I felt like in order to amount to anything as a musician, I had to work extra hard, and that's why I was interested in trying to do as many different things as I could. And all that started from, you know, playing in coffee houses in Virginia in the mid-'60s. Buck was the big direct influence on me down there in Richmond, Virginia, Buck Evans. And there were some local guys around. There was a guy who was very good and very convincing at playing Delta blues, real talented boy named Larry McCullough. And Larry is still a musician and has spent most of his life down in Louisiana playing kind of in show bands and stuff. Though I understand recently he started studying jazz and is doing that. And there were some other local guys, and of course I would learn things from them. I remember Larry, for instance, had gotten together with a friend of mine named Lynn Abbott, who is still a close friend, though he also lives down in Louisiana. And Lynn lives in New Orleans, and in fact has grown up to be sort of a historian and scholar about the history of early African-American music. Does a lot of articles in magazines like 78 Quarterly, along with Doug Suroff. They really do some good stuff. But I remember Lynn had that Library of Congress record with Mississippi Blues on it, and Larry had figured it out, only he had figured out which is slightly different. It actually adds one change to it. And I got that from him, and I remember real clearly sitting around the apartments that somebody had and figuring this stuff out and wearing the record out, as did all of us for that particular spectacular tune by Willie Brown. I certainly learned some things off of Doc Watson records. I remember learning the Deep River Blues, though for some reason I wanted that octave in it and did it that way. And the thing that's interesting about that is very much like Chet Atkins said the same thing. When he listened to Merle Travis getting a sound like that, he was sure he was using 3 fingers. And I'm sure that most of the people that bought Doc Watson's record and heard him going were sure he was using 3 fingers on his right hand. But both Merle and Doc, of course, only used the index finger. More power to him. And there's a reason for that. Doc or Merle would get a bass that was more like that, wouldn't it? And if you do that, then there's not really room. Boy, I can't do it. I can't think that way. I think by the time that I heard the people that I got to like the best as traditional guitar players like Blind Blake, Joseph Spence, Gary Davis, that I sort of had a way of playing. And so as much as I liked them and even tried to learn some of their songs, I didn't really copy licks from those guys. There wasn't anybody in Richmond, Virginia in the mid-'60s that was really playing that stuff. And so it was sort of faster to learn from Buck and to make up my own versions of songs like Sweet Georgia Brown or things like that. There was a guy in the late 60s in Richmond, Virginia named Dan McCourse, and I remember learning a couple of tunes from him, including Up a Lazy River. And I think, again, that was an arrangement he had gotten from somebody else. When I first started to play the guitar, I was playing steel string guitars. Obviously, the electric guitars that I was playing were steel strung, and the Silvertone guitar was a steel strung guitar. It's a little more complicated as to why I got into nylon strings, but I remember saying disparaging things about nylon strings, like the people that would hang around in the coffee houses and were listening to blues players, were trying to play whatever, Dave Van Ronk. There was a guitar player that influenced me, actually, that I forgot, right? And I would try to play his version of St. Louis Tickle. I would try to play that stuff, or John Hammond, and we would associate nylon string guitars with something like Joan Baez, and of course we were snobs about that. But I had a friend named Joe Shankman, who became a little bit better known as an underground cartoonist in the 70s. And he taught me actually my first finger-picking tune, come to think of it, which was a version of Cocaine by way of Van Ronk, sort of a cover of the Gary Davis Cocaine Blues. And when somebody said something disparaging about nylon string guitars, he pulled out a flamenco record and said, if you really listen to this stuff, it doesn't sound like the stuff that you're making these comments about. It's a very gutsy instrument. And until I went home and realized my dad had a flamenco record by Escudero, probably Montoya. And I was amazed by the sound of that. And I thought, when I listened to the way that they played their runs, well, if I could get a sound like that and play like jazz or something like that, it would be a great sound. And all these years later, I'm still sort of trying to catch up with that notion. I remember, for instance, when people see me play jazz, and they watch my right hand, a lot of guitar players will come up and say, well, were you an electric bass player? Where'd you get that? And the answer is that I was in a coffee house, backstage in a coffee house in Vancouver, BC in 1968. And anybody old enough can probably make a very good guess as to what I was doing in Vancouver in 1968. But there was a very good flamenco player there by coincidence, and I watched him do the rest stroke thing and saw that that's how he got that sort of biting sound and that attack. And so I went home and tried to imitate it, resting the finger on the lower string. But of course, the way I did it, I wound up kind of posting my little finger over on this side of the guitar instead of on this side, the way I do when I finger pick. So it doesn't really look like any kind of guitar player. It does, in fact, look more like an electric bass player. But the short answer is that I was attracted to the sound of the flamenco guitar, and I never have used a classical guitar for much of anything. I think maybe one tune that I recorded, I thought it would sound nice. But it's I like the bright sound, and I think it works really well for jazz, and I've never understood why more jazz guitar players don't use flamenco guitars. When I was playing back in the coffee houses of Richmond, Virginia in the mid-'60s and hanging around with Buck Evans, I wasn't just focusing on the line that would go from blues to jazz and include the African-American kinds of American music, but I was also interested in bluegrass and traditional stuff. And at some point I decided, well, wouldn't it be cool to play fiddle tunes on the guitar, as were all kinds of people around the country. I'm not even sure if I had heard anybody do it or heard of anybody do it. I don't remember that I had, but it seemed like an obvious thing to work on. And I think by 1970 I started trying to arrange this stuff. At the same time, of course, I was listening to traditional old-time music as well as bluegrass. I remember specifically the guy I mentioned, Dan McCorson, had some really good records. He had that Friends of Old Time Music thing where I heard, well, Watson was on there, but a lot of people I had never heard of, like Alameda Riddle, the Stanley Brothers. I didn't know who they were until I heard that record. Wonderful record that opened a lot of doors for me, because then, you know, I'd go out and listen to all those people. But a record that I really loved, and still love to this day, was the one on Kanawha by Franklin George, who played banjo and fiddle, was a West Virginia musician who's still alive. So he was like he was an in-between. He wasn't really a revivalist from the city, but he was from a generation that of people in West Virginia who had mostly turned their backs on traditional music and gone towards country. But Franklin George definitely didn't. And I noticed when I listened to the old-timey music that the Irish tunes seemed to have a really deep melodic flavor. And so tunes like, well, especially Temperance Reel, and its various guises. It's often called Teetotaler as well as other things. Johnny's Favorite is another name it's been called. And so that was a tune that fairly early on I decided I wanted to try to play. It was a tune that taught me a lot about the guitar. For one thing, that was when I was getting used to the idea that I wanted to play with this G shape and not move this finger around. Actually, I'll digress, because it was another Franklin George tune off that same record, or a tune he played on that same record, Angelina Baker, which of course originally was a Stephen Foster song, and he played it as a banjo tune. I'm sure I didn't know it was a Stephen Foster song in those days. But that tune goes like this, and that's what taught me about this thing, to keep the index finger as the one that plays the A and the E notes on the 4th and 3rd strings, instead of moving this finger over, because otherwise you don't know what you're doing. So I had this idea in mind for how to finger on these tunes, and then I finally tackled Temperance Reel. And the other thing I learned from Temperance Reel was I figured out that when you have melodies that consist sort of a lot of eighth notes, where they're going twice as fast as your quarter notes in the bass, that I had to learn how to alternate with my right hand fingers. And so that's what I did with that tune. after playing swing tunes for years and years and years, and always being a person that I loved free jazz, I loved modern jazz, I was listening to that all the time I was growing up. It just, to me, I had no idea what it was because I never went to school or took jazz guitar lessons. I didn't really like the jazz guitarists that I heard when I was growing up. I wasn't attracted to somebody like Kenny Burrell as a youngster. I liked the sound of the blues guitar players and so on. I mean, by now, yes, I like Kenny Burrell, I like all that stuff, but I certainly didn't learn how to play jazz along those lines. But ultimately, I sort of adopted my fingerstyle to where I could play more modern things, and I was arranging Thelonious Monk tunes and even a couple that had been played by Sonny Rollins and Bud Powell. And was sort of working in that world, and I always had contacts in the free jazz world. And at some point in the mid-1990s, John Zorn asked me if I'd like to do a record dedicated music by a very obscure modern jazz piano player who had a very complex conception, especially for harmony, a man named Herbie Nichols. And so I did that, and it's actually opened some doors for me in the jazz world. I'm now working on duos with a great trombone player, Roswell Rudd, who was a good friend of Herbie's and sort of an understudy of his back in the 60s before Herbie passed away at a young age. I think he was in his 40s and died around 1966. And this is a project that took me a couple of years' work and taught me more than everything else I've ever done, I think, about harmony and things like that. So I'll try to play you one of Herbie's great tunes, and this one's called The Third World. But it doesn't mean the third world the way we usually do when we talk about, you know, underdeveloped nations. It's because it actually predates that. He wrote the tune in the late 40s, and he was playing a gig, and this saxophone player listened to these chords he was playing and said, "Man, what in the world are you doing? You're in some kind of third world." So Herbie liked that and stole it, like any good artist does.